Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another awesome podcast that we have for you today, the 401 Access Denied. I'm Joseph Carson, one of your co-hosts based in Tallinn, Estonia. And we have some special guests on the show today to really talk about some important history lessons around cyber war, cyber defense, and some creative innovations. So, I'm Joseph Carson, Chief Security Scientist at Thycotic. And I'm joined here with my co-host, the awesome Mike Gruen, MG. So, Mike, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. So Mike Gruen, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary. We're here joined by Raul. I'll let him introduce himself from Estonian Government.
Yes, good day for everyone. I'm Raul Rikk, and I work in Estonia in the government sector as the National Cyber Security Policy Director. And my main responsibility is to take care that the Estonian cyber space is safe and sound.
Awesome. That's a very, very big responsibility that you have. It's something that many countries around the world are always challenged with. And I think just to give a lot of our audience, probably they've heard me saying about Estonia many times on our podcast, and talking about some of the great innovations and even around the identity system Estonia has. Could you give us just a little bit of background about Estonia as a country and a little bit about the history, and probably for the audience maybe a geographical lesson as well into where it's located?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Estonia is located in the northern Europe. So above us there is a Finland. In the left side there is Sweden. In the right side there is a big, nice, good neighbor Russia, and the south side there is a Latvia. So we considered ourselves being as the Northern Europeans.
Absolutely, and I think I've been here for many years. For me, it's 19 years now in Estonia. I do find that from a culture perspective, it is very, very similar to that of Finland and Sweden. So from a culture perspective, I do feel very much a Nordic country. So that's something kind of for me that relation-wise. But Estonia has had a very interesting journey as a digital society, and I always find it very fascinating into some of the innovations. Of course, most people probably are familiar with Estonia from the likes of Skype. They're familiar. Many people are still using and familiar with Skype today. It's helped them through a lot of the remote working, and also from things like Pipedrive as well and TransferWise. Some people don't know that those companies are based in Estonia. Can you give us a little bit about Estonia's kind of, let's say, the journey as a digital society and some of those lessons learned over the years?
Yes, certainly. For us, the digital development started actually in the beginning of '90s when we got our independence back. So our short history, has been that after the Second World War, we were occupied by Russia, by Soviet Union actually, and of course we were not happy about that. And finally, in the beginning of '90s, we were able to get our freedom back, and then we had a big question that how to develop the society as a general, but also that what is the most efficient way of doing that? Because Estonian population is not big. It's only 1.5 million people, so not much. And we had to figure out that how to get the efficiency and effectiveness in our daily activities. And during this time, we also see that digital systems started to develop. So there were many different innovations happened already. And the 90s were the years where a lot of different things happened. The internet got quicker and the speed got better. And also we saw different applications coming into service and et cetera. So we thought logically that, the ICT systems basically save our time, and if you use them, we can compete with other countries. And of course, Estonian goals were that we wanted to become part of European Union and NATO. So basically, we had to compete with the big boys in the league. So we were the small one. And if you go and play with the big guys, they don't care how big or small you are. You have to be, quick and efficient. So we saw that if we use ICT and if we do it well, we can actually compete with them. So it was all about transparency, effectiveness, and also competitiveness, economic competitiveness. And that's why we started to use ICT. And it seems to be that we did it quite well. So as you mentioned, Skype comes from Estonia, and Pipedrive and other TransferWise and many other innovations like Bolt as well that competes with Uber and etc. etc. So it was kind of logical way to do things when you are able to start your country all over again. So that's how our journey started.
Do you think there
Absolutely.
was like an advantage to the fact that you were smaller, that made it maybe a little bit easier than if you were, larger and starting over? I'm curious.
Actually, I don't think that that the ICT development depends on the size of the country. I think it was rather the aspect that our political system was not matured yet. So our politicians were able to make decisions that in bigger or older countries is really, really hard. Like, for example, in the United States, you have certain understanding how you ensure privacy and what are the rights of the normal people, wear guns and etc. etc. But we didn't have that. So we look at the ICT as a possibility. And I think because of that, we were able to innovate so quickly in the government sector.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing, Mike, that we've always discussed previously, when we talked about things from a digital perspective in the US, that it's more likely going to happen, because of the political blocking issues there, that it's more likely going to happen at a state level than it will happen at a federal level. And we see that just, it's more the limitations of a political being able to agree and move forward. And I think I agree with Estonia that, at the time that, if you don't have those political barriers, then you can innovate very quickly and adapt and accept a change as well, quickly as well. And I think, Raul, one of the also factors for me is that it's about two items. One is the government's ability to plan and agree the strategy moving forward, but it's also the ability for the citizens to accept and use it as well, and get the advantage and benefits from it. I think that's one of the critical things, is that they see it as an enabler for them versus that something as it's just an additional check that many governments put in place. Do you see that how accepting has the citizens been of the ITC sector and solutions that the government's been rolling out?
Yeah, very good questions. I just comment one aspect that you mentioned, that maybe this innovation should or could happen in the United States at the federal or state level, not in federal level. I actually don't think that it's possible, because the way how we use at least the ICT is that it has to happen at least at the state level, or in Estonia, I mean, but in US in the federal level, because the systems are connected, and you simply don't get the benefits out of the implementation of ICT if you keep it only at the state level. So, for example, I think the innovation that we did first was the digital identification. So it's actually a security measure. But the basic problem with the internet connectivity was that nobody trusted really that who's the other side. So we solved the problem of the unsecurity of the internet. And if you do it at the state level, then all these services you can have only at the state level. But that doesn't give the efficiency to you. What we tried to do is that we started to issue this ID cards or digital identification for everybody. So the companies, the private sector, public sector, citizens, they were all connected to the same ecosystem. So everybody was able to identify themselves for the others. So if you were a businessman, you were able to do that for the government. The government was able to give whatever they had to give, the authorizations or some licenses or whatever was there to the private sector, and citizens were able to use the whole ecosystem. So the main innovation was that securing the internet the way that all different parties, like citizens, government, the public sector, and business sector, was able to use that. So that was the real innovation.
Absolutely, and that's critical. I think one of the things that I think you mentioned that is for me is really important is that everyone's using the same system. Is what's critical. There's no two-tier systems that for one difference for businesses and for government, and also the transparency as well. I think that was really critical. Is that the citizens can log into the systems and see their own data and the accuracy, and also update it themselves. So that for me is also building the trust between the citizens and the government. Do you want to kind of comment around how is that trust being maintained, and what's the government doing around making sure that the transparency and trust is there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it started the way that one of the first services was the tax declaration that government simply simplified for the citizens. So the government was able to gather all the existing information according to the regulations and pre-fill the tax declaration for citizens. So before it was like, I think there were like hundreds of different pages that we had to fill on paper, and it was a really painful process. So once it was automated, and from the citizen's point of view, it meant simply that I log into the system, I identify myself with a digital identification, so it's a trusted system, and I just checked whether or not everything is correct, and I pressed OK. So my tax declaration was done in 5 minutes. So, and because we didn't see any incidents with the system for many years, people started to trust it. And because it was so simple, people didn't only trust the system, but they started to demand or actually expecting that other government activities happened the same way. So nobody wanted to go to the service center if there was a system that did the work for you, and then you just check it as a boss, and you pressed OK. So I think this trustworthiness of the system, and on the other hand, the comfortability that came with this digitalization were the factors that created the trust and created also huge demand.
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the U.S. I mean, I think our country is sort of founded on this notion of don't trust the government. So you have there's a cultural there's just that makes it very, very challenging, especially at the federal level. When you think about that, we have
But we actually control the government. The citizens control the government because by the law and regulations, governments always have certain right to have your data. But if you don't have the digital system, you simply don't know what kind of data government has about you. But we have this oversight. So the government has responsibility to show me as a citizen what kind of data government has and how they use that. So I can check from the system when the policeman checked me last, or when they stopped me, or what kind of fine I have got for speeding too much, for example, etc., etc. So I had this overview.
Yeah. And for me, one of the things is that that's what's really critical, and I find that I think Estonia really evolved into that the government is really truly become a true service provider to the citizens. That's kind of how I make the comparison, is that it has become a government service provider providing services to the citizen. And it's the citizens who are the boss, and the ability to audit, the ability to see what's happening to their data, keep it up to date, keep it accurate, in order for the government to provide better services continuously to the citizens as well. I think that's what's crucial, and it's one of the biggest differences, that it's not about leaving the government to make the decisions, but it's about making sure that the government's doing everything they can to provide better services to the citizens.
Exactly. I actually, when you mentioned that, I started to think that if I have ever thought the way that government has only the right to decide on certain things, because I have always thought the way that we have the government because we want certain common services from the government. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the mentality throughout Estonia, that citizens have this perception that the reason why we have the government is because they should provide certain services to us. And digitalization is, of course, one of the things there.
Absolutely. And, along this digital journey, there's always bumps in the road. And so there's always sometimes challenges. And I think one of the kind of more widely documented and talked about one, even in many conferences that I go to around the world, is, the cyber attack that happened back in 2007. And I'm, being here at the time, I remember there was, some even violence in the streets, there was disruptions, there was a major denial of service. Can you talk a bit about, the experience that was happening then, and what did the government change as a result of that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a quite famous case. What simply happened was that uh, the Russian government didn't like much that Estonia is an independent state, and they started to organize riots on the streets. And also, as I remember right, we had 4 Russian parliamentarians coming to Estonia. They actually demanded the change of the government. So it was a bigger situation, just not just the cyber attack against Estonia, but at the same time, when these riots started on the streets organized by Russia and conducted through the Russian minority in Estonia, at the same time we started to experience massive cyber attacks. And I have to mention that before that, we already had implemented electronic identification and the systems were actually secure. But what the Russian hackers were actually able to do, they were able to conduct a denial of service attack against Estonia. So basically, they jammed our network traffic, just like in the physical world. Somebody comes and with a lot of different cars and vehicles, and they just jams the traffic. So that's exactly the same thing happened in Estonia. So they tried to cut Estonia off from the rest of the world. So our internet connectivity didn't work well. And they also tried to intrude certain systems that they were not able to do. But the jamming was the main thing. And of course, what we did was very simple. We first started to cooperate with other countries. We cut off the bad traffic to the Estonia. So we were able to maintain first our internal internet connectivity, but later also the connectivity to the rest of the world. And the main lessons learned was from this time that okay, we can certainly, or we have to ensure the basic level of security. But if something like that happens, then we need a special and certain capabilities to deal with these bigger attacks against us as well. So we started to develop our emergency planning in cyber sector. We created certain capabilities for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so they were able to communicate with other countries about this issue. After that, also the international computer incident response teams community started to develop. So there are many different things that happened after that. But during 2007, there wasn't these capabilities in place. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember actually, that Estonia was one of the first to actually establish that, the CERT teams. And actually that foundation of the CERT teams as well was also kind of had helped establish many CERT teams around the world. I know that the Estonian CERT team trained and helped set up the Irish CERT team, helped set up the New Zealand recently, Australia. So many countries around the world have also, gained from that knowledge and have benefited from Estonia's really kind of putting in. And I think it really, one thing I'd like to mention as well is back then I remember there was two items I remember. That one was the establishment of the Cyber Defense League, which came together as a result of that, and has also grown in numbers and in practice since then. So that was one area, and there was also around 2008. There's also the setup of the NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and also the discussions around with the European Organization for Security about how to, because there was two items. Was the DDoS attack itself, and it was the second biggest DDoS attack at the time. The first one, I think, went back to 2001, which is the Reagan DDoS attack, and this was the second biggest one since then. It was significant, and as a result of that, not only did the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence set up, but I also like to kind of mention maybe a little bit about around the data embassy concept, because that's something I think for me was a great innovative idea in order to become decentralized, to have not one target of attack that allowed the country to almost become a true digital society as well. So first, you mentioned a little bit about the Cyber Defense League and how important it is, and maybe should that be an example for other countries to maybe work with the public sector as well?
Yes, first about the Cyber Defense League. The necessity for the Cyber Defense League comes from the calculation that none of the organizations have enough resources if some big incident or crisis in the cyber sector happens. So usually if something big happens, we need support. And the question was that how to organize the support for these organizations being under attack or experiencing bigger or longer lasting cyber incident or crisis. So we thought that we have this voluntary military organization in Estonia that we call Defense League. It's similar to US National Guard. And we thought that we use this organization in order to organize these experts that we have in the cyber field who are willing to support other organizations being under attack. And that's how this Cyber Defense League idea started. And so far we have developed it, and the main idea is that they organize themselves the way that if somebody needs support being under attack, then they can support them. So that's the whole idea and concept. And it has worked quite well. Regarding the data embassy idea, that's another issue that we all face, is that the cyber attacks are global and cyber incidents are global as well. And we have all different threats that are target our, or that we have to consider ensuring the safety of our cyberspace. And for example, if the sun gets too active, it might generate electromagnetic pulse, and everything but is one side of the world or the earth could be harmed. So the idea is that because we are so dependent on the digital systems, we have to keep our data not only in Estonia but other places around the world as well. So ideally, we would like to keep our data in Estonia, for example, also in US and also in Australia, so different parts of the world. And now when we want to do that, there's a question that if we put our data in other countries' jurisdiction, then how to ensure that the other countries' security service or police or whatever is there doesn't have the right to go there and take our data or to do something with it. So that's why we started to develop this data embassy concept. So when we keep our data in another country, then this data has to be considered as the part of Estonia or being our property. So that's how it started.
Yep, I remember many discussions around that topic with Davi and others at the time. So kind of one of the things I actually never thought about, for me, it was always about making sure that Estonia could, even from a cyber attack, that it also decentralized into multiple countries. So it even would trigger something like Article 5 in NATO as well. If you want to attack Estonia, it had to, target all of those locations simultaneously or together. But yeah, I never thought about it as such a bigger concept. I was struggled, why would the US maybe want to do a data embassy idea? Because they have so much land space as well. So I never really thought about what happens if a true natural disaster does happen. How can, and that scale, how can you continue as a society with that much damage? And but yes, major impacts, asteroids, whether it be or solar flares that can have a significant, let's say, electromagnetic impact. It takes all of that systems out on one side of the planet. Absolutely, I never kind of thought of that side of things. So it was interesting perspective.
And now I just want to say that it's related to the digital dependency. That if you are truly dependent on the digital systems, like we have, we don't keep our data on the paper. Everything is in digital format in somewhere in the databases. And if you depend on that almost 100%, then the question is how you can actually ensure that nothing happens. And then you start to think all sorts of different risks. and of course the measures are just the ways how to mitigate these.
Yeah. And so for running the data embassies, I remember initially they were actually put in the actual Estonian embassy locations for a period of time. And they've started moving them into proper data centers because they provide much more resiliency, availability, protection stuff. Where I remember reading that the first one was in Luxembourg. Is there plans to scale that out further, or has it already been happening?
Yes, we have plans because yes, the first location as the pilot project was done in Luxembourg, but we still we also think that the possibility to keep the data in our close to our embassies, or at least on the embassy's territory, it's also a good aspect, because at the moment, the Luxembourg, we can call it data embassy, but in the according to the international agreements, it's not considered as the embassy territory. So it's not the Estonian territory. And if somebody does, for example, physical attack against this data center, we cannot say that it was attack against the Estonian territory. If we keep the data in our embassy territory, then the attack against the embassy is attack against Estonia. So there are different political aspects as well. So we still develop the concept further, but the difficulty is that where we have embassies, there is not always the best internet connectivity, and to duplicate data in these locations, it's kind of like a technical, we have to consider different aspects. So the case is that we develop it further, and let's say how we finalize that.
Right. And just a little bit going back just on the cyber defense league piece again, one thing that a lot of countries have been investing into cyber offensive as well, into offensive capabilities, and it's been on the increase, mostly for, preemptive type of scenarios. How much is the government, working on offensive capabilities, and is that, and also including the cyber defense league as well? Are they also considered an offensive team?
Yes, not maybe so much in the defense league, but in the defense forces, certainly. We have cyber command in our defense forces, and it's already, I think several years ago, we declared that we consider cyberspace the same way as other physical places like land, sea, and airspace. So we certainly need capabilities, military capabilities for cyber operations as well. So we do that, but of course I cannot comment it too specifically that what kind of capabilities we have.
Absolutely, no problem. If for other countries, one thing that I've always remembered was around the ROI side of things. I mean, how much is the digital ICT systems for Estonia? How much is it helping the society? Other than just doing things online. What's the value to the people? I remember a number of years back, maybe it's 4 or 5 years, around there was a calculation that it was something around 6 days GDP per year that it was actually saving, and wasted time. People not having to do queues, not having to wait for days for prescriptions or so forth, and medical appointments with doctors. Where is that right now at the moment? Where's the value, and what's that calculation happening today?
Yeah, the value is huge. To calculate very precisely, it's probably not possible, but we can do the rough calculation. I just give, to illustrate the situation, I can give an example. I had a course, I went to school in the United States, I think it was 2005, when we had the first elections in Estonia. And I think it was first time when we were able to elect parliament electronically, so over the internet, using the electronic identification method. So I was in the States. My course mate was from Belgium, and in Belgium, the voting is mandatory. So if they don't vote, they get the fine. So my classmate had to vote. But because they didn't have the electronic voting system, he had to travel 2 times to the Washington, D.C., first to get the papers in order to fill all sorts of formats, and the second time to actually vote and then give the vote to the embassy people. So he said that the whole procedure took about 2 weeks to do. And then I showed to him that how we do in Estonia. I just opened my laptop, I logged in with my digital identification card, and I did the voting in 2 minutes. So you can see 2 minutes versus two weeks.
A lot of
And
money.
we have calculated the way that, yeah, it's a lot of money. And if every Estonian uses the digital identification card for giving signatures, the person can probably save at least 1 week per year, or probably even more. And 1 week per year is about 2% of GDP. And 2% of GDP is a huge number. It's actually the 2% of GDP is the number that NATO countries, NATO allies, are requested to invest to the national defense. So we can say that using digital identification and digital signature, we can afford the military forces.
That's a really good perspective on it. So there's Mike, what if the US was to do something like that to save even 2% GDP per year?
I mean, yeah, there's, I think we could save a lot more, probably, just based on all the bureaucracy. But again, there's so many considerations, I think, in the US around privacy and security and government that it becomes like this intractable problem. As you were talking, I'm trying to think like how does the US, how would something like this happen in the US, and how could it make, how do you make sure that it's really seen as that the government's seen as a service provider, which I don't think that, I think that right there, that's the first hurdle. And so, but yeah, no, I think it would be interesting to see. And I think the ROI arguments are definitely very effective. I also think it's really interesting to think about the geo, when you start mapping cybersecurity and cyberspace onto actual geolocation, and because that's one of the biggest challenges is cyberspace exists in an abstract universe, but then does tie back down into physical systems, whether it's, you only have so many connections. This country only has so many connections to other countries coming in on the internet, like actual physical connections or data centers and the rest of it. And I think that's a huge challenge for every country moving forward, is this sort of globalization of information, at the same time keeping your citizens' rights protected, even as their data exists in other places around the world where maybe those rights don't exist. And I think it's a huge challenge. I'm curious, like, when you guys are thinking about the digital embassies and how it sounds like that's the reason for putting them at actual physical embassies, because you still have that control. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's for certain data, like basic registers, like a population registry, business registry. It makes a lot of sense, because this is the data that we have to ensure the security with all possible ways. But you're very right that there are many services that are provided globally. Like we probably all use Microsoft Office software to do our, keep the calendar and do some other things, exchange emails and etc. etc. The question is always that it's not only the question in the context of Microsoft, but the question is that where the company keeps the data, and do they use the global different sites globally? Like maybe they keep in India or in China or in some other country. So we have to certainly ensure that wherever this or what the operations that the private businesses do, providing services to us, we have to ensure the security there as well. And the question or the challenge is these days that how to do that. So one way how the whole Europe does that, or European Union, is throughout the general data protection law. I know that when we mention laws, it gets really boring. But the real question is that we want to make sure that the companies who provide services to our citizens, that wherever these companies are, and it doesn't matter in which jurisdiction, they have to respect the laws of our European Union citizens. So basically, our logic is that the data belongs to the citizen, and we have to make sure that the businesses respect that.
So Raul, that's an interesting. So it's got me thinking. Kind of, now my innovation thinking hat is coming on at the moment, and it got me kind of thinking when you're saying. I remember absolutely the data embassy. With the part was around the data that was actually bound to sovereign law. So citizens' data that was bound by the law in Estonia that had to be maintained, and the whole concept was that you weren't allowed to keep that data outside because it was breaching the law side of things. So, and that was the idea to be able to put it in other countries. But now it kind of get me thinking about there's two types of data here. There's the data that's bound by the law, such as the population registry and other types of specific, whether it being tax returns and so forth. And then you've got other types of data, which is just simply the type of data that's flowing through the likes of technology providers out there, social media and so forth. And it gets into there's two concepts. One is absolutely the data embassies is when it gets into those really the legal boundaries. So that's really where the framework is. And I remember a conversation I had many years ago. It was around the early days of GDPR with one of the ministers in the European courts. And the way that he put it to me was GDPR was like putting a flag on data. That it was like, in international waters, that when you put a flag on that data, no matter where it travels in cyberspace, you want to have some type of boundaries of legal binding agreement. And that was the whole idea of GDPR, was that as data flew from port to port, data center to data center, it didn't really matter where it ended up being located. That flag on that piece of data, being GDPR, meant that you had a legal framework that was bound to it. And that allowed innovation to happen. It allowed technology to avail and data to really keep that ownership of citizens. So it gets me into that as GDPR and data embassies are really work hand in hand with achieving those two concepts of sovereign data and citizens' data and allowing it to work together. So that's an interesting kind of ability. I think many countries around the world can probably, even countries within Europe can take that approach to looking at sovereign data plus citizens' data as two separate items. But I think this is an idea for many countries to adopt to something similar. So therefore, we're not trying to put firewalls up to prevent data from going beyond the firewall. It's more legal frameworks that allows it to work freely.
As someone who has to, as an individual who likes GDPR from my own individual perspective, but then also Cybrary, right? We're global. We deal with user data around the world. I do find it interesting and somewhat frustrating that, for example, I firmly believe all of the data about our users belongs to our users. We have a B2B offering, but the idea with Cybrary is it's a career development platform. You're with us for life. We don't really care what company you work for at the time. But we do have a B2B offering where we're selling the ability for a company to provide Cybrary to their employees. And it's frustrating to sort of get into these conversations with these businesses who believe they now own the data. A lot of European countries think of us as a data processor, when my feeling is no, the users are the owners. We're providing you access to this information. That's what you're paying us for. And these users are signing up and saying, yes, I agree to allow this company to see my data. And so I think there's still all this really gray matter in GDPR, because these are arguments I'm not winning with the businesses who are like, no, these are our employees. That's our data. And yes, they have rights to that data, but it's still our data. And it's a little frustrating. And then I also think about, as other countries come online and they create their own versions of GDPR, which may be very, very different than the European and American views of data, where they might say things like, no, as a government, we have every right to we have access to that data, not the citizens. And so how you create that patchwork and framework of understanding who's this user and where are they located and where are they a citizen and what laws do we have to map to? It is a little daunting to think about the future if everybody starts coming out with different frameworks that are contradictory. So I'm curious. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those interesting things that we'll see play out over the next few years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I see.
exactly. I think
Yeah.
as well that what we're gonna see in the future is that different cultures or different how to say societies think differently about this the data ownership and protection as well, and it's very possible that we're gonna see that. How the internet and how the services are going to be split between different cultures. So maybe there is one logic in I don't want to. I don't want to draw very big lines, but let's say the way that maybe in Asia there is one understanding how to do things, but in Western world there is different, and there's nothing to do. I think there's going to be some kind of boundaries between these different logics,
Yeah,
and
no,
of
I
course
agree.
it's not good for the yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. I think, like, when I think about it as an implementer, the easiest solution is just to say, you know what, we're going to stand up a Cybrary in Europe that's going to adhere to all of the European standards. We're going to stand up a Cybrary in Asia, and we'll figure out how, like, when somebody moves from location A to location B, to transfer their information and this, you know. And I think it saddens me a little bit to think about taking this abstract cybersecurity goes across all borders, all nations, and then having to map it back onto a globe for no other, you know, for no other reason, but at the same time, good reasons, because societies, culture, and laws exist to protect citizens, and that's, it'll be an interesting metamorphosis over time of the internet, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, nobody wants to actually. We don't want that this happens,
Right.
but it happens because there are different governments and different logics, and we have seen it throughout the history that the first when new innovation takes place, there is a little bit this kind of like a Wild West time, and after that the countries start to organize this area, and this is exactly what we're gonna see in the related to the global internet and the electronic systems as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And ultimately, for me, one of the things I kind of came to realize is that things like GDPR and when we talk about data privacy and data rights and data ownership, it ultimately really comes down to for me, it's a data rights management issue, just like you do with any other industry like music or copyrights and so forth and IP. It comes down to this is the IP of the person, and therefore rather than it being an industry of selling data, but will be an industry of renting. It's a more become of a kind of, you're giving it for a period of time. Just like, when you buy music, you're no longer buying music, you're paying for the service of streaming it. You don't own the actual copy. Same with movies and other types of things. You're no longer, buying the physical and owning that for, whatever generations to come. It gets into that you're going to, have it for the period of time you have that service. And the same with the citizen and technology providers. It comes into that, it gets into that this is really the citizen providing a service agreement for those companies to rent their data for that time they're using service, not to sell it, not to own it, not to take economical advantage of it, but simply they're as the product or service that they're delivering, they're able to use that for the period of time that they're subscribed. So, Raul, one of the
There's only one question: who is the data owner?
That was a big question I had many years ago when it was Estonia had the EU presidency. That was the big question that I raised to the Supreme Court at the time during the data conference that was at the time, was who owns the data under GDPR. And it's not actually specifically specified in GDPR that who's the data. It's assumed. It's classified as the data subject. Who is the subject? But ownership.
But it gets even more complicated about ownership when you talk about the not just the data that I own about myself, but then if I as a company start aggregating data and it's about the usage of my service, when you're allowing me, you're using my service, I'm collecting this information about you, and you decide to leave my service, that data that is specific about how the sort of aggregate and analyzed information that says like, hey, these courses were performed really well, and this however you want to sort of look at it, that's where it starts to really get gray, is when somebody says, I want to delete my information and I don't want you to have access to it anymore. Does that also mean what's the impact to all of these other systems that have been built on aggregating all of this data across our user base?
Influencers and anonymized.
and who owns that aggregated version of the data. And I think that's where it really starts to get messy.
Yeah, but I think at least in Europe it's clear now, according to the GDPR, all data that is related to the person belongs to the person. Simple as that. There is no, gray areas. I think where the gray area comes is that different countries have different approaches. That Europe has this approach that person owns the data. As I understand, the US, the logic is rather that the company who gathers and collects the data is the data owner. And of course, in some countries like Russia and China, they promote the idea that the government owns the data because it's in their jurisdiction. So different ways. But of course, from European perspective, I would say that it's quite clear. At least for us.
You say that, but that's where a lot of the discussions that I have with European companies who, getting back to that B2B example, where they believe that they own the data about their employees because they're the ones paying for the service. And I'm making the argument, no, you don't own that data. You're just getting access to it. It's this data subject who owns it. There's definitely still, while there might not be a gray area in the law, there's certainly, I think, understanding and people getting to that level of understanding.
Yeah, interpretation of the subjects.
The example you gave for some time ago was very good. That from European perspective, the data is flagged, putting the flag on the ship going to the international waters. So from European perspective, the data is flagged. The flag belongs to the person, and wherever this data is belongs to the flag owner. So
yes, no, I like that.
It's a good example.
It was during. I remember it was like 2011. I was doing the Ministry of Transportation for Europe, and one of the Supreme Court was there. We were having this discussion for GDPR at the time, and it was like I was working in a lot of the maritime industry at the time. We were working in things like autonomous shipping. And I was a bit, actually, to be honest, I was against GDPR at the time. My mindset was like, why are you punishing these companies, for, being attacked by bad people? And the minister kind of took me aside and was like, let me explain it as I see it. And that's how he explained it to me, was taking international waters. Now, ironically, the funny thing was we had a meeting about 5-6 years later, around 2015. It was just getting into the final drafts of GDPR. And we were having a roundtable discussion, and at the same time, we were actually, having the meeting, and we realized that was the time when we realized that GDPR didn't apply in international waters, which was a fun conversation that we had. And that's when, shortly after that, we came into a crisis meeting with the International Maritime Organization in order to build this framework for international waters for cybersecurity and data protection. And the ironic thing was, this is when all of the technology providers came out with these data center barges, and where they'd float them out to international waters in order to, try to get around some of the legal aspects of things. So it was an interesting kind of series of events. But one thing, what I would like to what would you recommend for other countries? How, if you were to recommend to other countries of how, what they should do in taking from the lessons that Estonia has learned over these years, and some of the kind of, where should they think about starting? What types of systems or what types of kind of prioritizations to take? What would you, what recommendations would you have for other countries if they were to take the same journey?
Yes, I think that there's one thing that I would like to promote. That's the digital identification, because it's like a passport to the digital world. So we have the physical world, and if we want to travel, we have our passport with us, so we can identify ourselves. In the digital world, there is exactly the same need. If you don't have this digital passport, it is impossible to identify and do legal activities. So what we can do with this digital ID is to give legally binding signatures, which means that I can do all legal operations wherever I am around the world. I can even vote for the parliament or the local elections, etc., etc. So I can do everything. So I really cannot imagine anymore that how to ensure the basic level security without having this digital identification. I simply can't, can't imagine that how it's possible. Because if you don't have that, then you have to deal with certain incidents on daily basis over and over again. It gets really boring.
Absolutely. The foundation for me is really a strong identity and access management foundation. That's really where everything is built upon. And, for some services, you can decide to use it or not to use it that don't require, you can still have some anonymity. But there's certain services that you must have. And many of those today, for many countries, are still in that physical form. And I think Estonia is really taking that innovation-wise. So, kind of next thing is that, what next? Where is Estonia taking it? What's the next kind of phase? I've seen over the years many services like prescriptions online, logistics has been amazing. I can't tell you how well. One of the things I've found in the last couple of months is things like ordering things online, home delivery side of things. Online school is being increasing significantly. So a lot of these have allowed the country to continue providing services in a digital sense. So what next? Where's the next direction? What's the next big thing?
I think the next big thing is probably the application or apps consolidation. So it means that at the moment we have different apps from the government's perspective. So we have different ministries or agencies who provide different services, but you still need to go to different places to do the thing. But we want to integrate this. That according to the life events, like if you get married, for example, then there is a one procedure. You don't need to go to different digital environments to do the official procedure. You do the one flow. If you get the first child, for example, or if you get a child second or third one, same way. It's a life event. You do this through one through one application, and etc. So I think that's probably the next big thing, and of course everything related to the artificial intelligence solution. So even better automatization and effectiveness that comes through that. So I think these two aspects are the biggest.
Also, I completely, for me, I've always taken the concept is that, I remember 10, 15 years ago when I was working, we were really focused around, it was called software-defined networks, really looking at it from a software perspective. And I learned, from Estonia that was the wrong way to view what you're doing. My goal is not to deploy software. My goal is to provide services and thinking about, well, what is the, top services that I need to provide to the people? And how do I make those as seamless as possible? What's the things that people do the most often? And I think it's great, starting with the taxes and voting and banking and stuff. But it's really getting to that point where it's really thinking about that I don't need, there's one process that might affect many different systems. How do I make that process as simple and as intuitive possible? That doesn't mean I have to go to different places, such as marriage and kids. You would have to go to different locations in order to do that flow. That simplifying that is amazing.
But also, how to make the system more automated and even invisible as well. So, for example, we have a very good case that somebody has asked sometimes that how we organize the driving licenses. What we don't need driving licenses anymore. We don't have driving licenses in Estonia because why do you have that if all information is in the data center or in the register? So when the police stops you, they identify you according to the picture that they have in their database. You say your name, they identify you, and then they know exactly that whether or not you have the driving license or not. So we don't need to carry that anymore. So that means that you eliminate the ineffective parts of the process and you deal only with this effective parts.
I agree. It's always about, I think what is that it's not about showing as much data as possible, it's about asking the right questions. I've always found is that all that the police officer needs to know is that, are you legal to drive? So simply, that's the question that they have. And that question might mean, are you old enough? Do you have insurance? Is this car yours? That's the things. So their question is, are you legal to drive? And all of those different pieces of information might come from sources. So I remember years ago in UK, you might get stopped by a police officer and they say, show me your driver's license. I want to see your car documents. where's your insurance forms? And you would have to have open your glove compartment. They would have a pile of documents you'd have to go and show. So, and that contains lots of information. It might contain how much you paid. It might contain other types of sensitive information, telephone numbers, things that they don't really necessarily need to know. All they need to know is that are those documents valid, and they don't necessarily need to see them. And I think it's always getting down to asking the right questions and providing trusted sources that can provide the answers to those questions. It's ultimately kind of where to go.
Exactly.
And I have one question though: is the Estonian bots? We talked about a little bit of going down this automation path. Who came up with the name Krat? And can you tell me what Krat means in Estonia? As far as I know, it's a little devil or something, like some type of elf or something.
No, yeah, it was like it comes from our folklore. There was a story. We have one very famous writer in Estonia. He wrote the story that when Estonians were living in the countryside long time ago, they were not very rich, and in order to make their work easier, they kind of created a how to say, they put together like a doll that actually became alive and did the work for them. So basically, it was kind of like a let's say artificial servant that everybody were able to make with wood and nails and create this kind of thing that did all the hard work for themselves for them. So that's where this and it was called Krat. And that's yeah. Yeah, it's a funny story actually behind it.
Yeah, maybe that's something I'll have over a coffee with Seam to find out what. But yeah, because I always had, because I have an idea of the story where it came from, but I didn't have it in that perspective that way. That it was about having somebody doing the work for you. And now it makes sense. Now it makes sense why it's called Krat. So, but Raul, it's been awesome having you on this show, and I think it's been great and listening to some of the amazing things that Estonia is doing, and I hope that this continues and that other countries can really continue. And I completely agree that it doesn't come down to the size of the country. I think it really comes down to the political stability and motivation to make things happen, and ultimately that other countries can really
exactly.
They can really take a service provider approach. How can we provide better services, not just how we can maintain the status quo. I think that's what's critical. So it's amazing having you on the show. I'd really thank you. Is there any last comments, anything you would like to share with the audience before we close it?
I think it's worth, if we can do everything with 1.5 million people, that you can imagine what you can do over 300 million. So
it's a lesson for the US. So for sure. So, Mike, any closing words for yourself? Any thoughts? Has this been educational for you?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's been very interesting, and I've enjoyed the conversation very much. So I appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Many thanks, Raul. And
the pleasure was mine.
Hopefully, I get to catch up with you at some point in the physical world. So we'll see how things evolve. But for the audience, it's amazing. Listen to Raul and what Estonia's been doing. And I think for this is something out there that you have a voice to be able to demand similar things and experiences for yourselves, and how important security is, and how important identity and access management is really to the foundation. And ultimately, the real goal is that trust and transparency, and building services that work for us. I think we do need many more Krats in the world. Something you can get into the Kalev Borg stories, which I'll put a little bit of notes in the show notes afterwards. But many thanks for attending the show. Do catch up with us every 2 weeks. We'll tune in for the podcast, subscribe. You get to listen to myself and Mike going on once in a while about, which sometimes you get into our rants and tantrums. But I hope it's always a fun discussion. Stay safe, and catch up with you soon, and have a safe day. Thank you.